Hello and welcome back to the ILO's Future of Work podcast. I'm Sophie Fisher. Forced labour is not just a brutal abuse of fundamental human rights. It's also an economic issue, one that feeds crime, helps to perpetuate poverty, and damages legitimate businesses. A new report from the ILO has found that forced labour in the private sector generates $236 billion in illegal profits every year. What's more, that number has increased by more than a third in the last decade. The number of people in forced labour at any one time has also gone up to around 28 million. The ILO report is Profits and Poverty, the Economics of Forced Labour. And with me to discuss the findings is Michaëlle, head of the research unit of the Fundamental Principles Department at the ILO. I'm also joined by Anousheh, the French government delegate to the ILO. France, in particular the Ministry of Labour, partly financed this report. So thank you both for joining me and welcome.
Good morning.
Michaëlle, let me start with you. What do we mean by profits? We often talk about the number of people in forced labour, but we don't so much talk about the financial side. And presumably these people, they're not filing tax returns. So how are you estimating profits?
No, correct. Thank you very much for organising this podcast and giving us the opportunity to talk about this scandal about the profits made on the back of the victims of forced labour. Here, in order to explain what we mean by illegal profits, I need also to go back to the victims of forced labour. In our 28 million estimate of the number of people victims of forced labour at any moment of time, as we speak today, 28 million people are in forced labour. Some are in a situation of labour imposed by state authorities. They are not part of our estimate of profits. So we limit the profits to those who are exploited by private. And they can be either in the, let's say, usual economy, and we'll go back to that later, so working in any kind of sector of the economy, or also they can be in commercial sexual exploitation, mainly in forced prostitution. So for those who are in the forced labour exploitation, what we have measured and called profit is only the difference between what the employers would pay to workers under normal circumstances and what these victims are actually paid for their work in a situation of forced labour. So the difference is the profit for this part. For the victims of forced sexual exploitation, as there is no standards on levels of payment, what we call illegal profits is all the profits, all the revenue made by the pimps, by those exploiting these victims, minus the little tiny share that trickle down to the victims.
Right, okay. One of the interesting things in your report is that although sexual exploitation accounts for more than 2/3 of these illegal profits, more than 73% or so, it was also found in industry, agriculture, agricultural services and domestic labour. So since the service sector excludes sexual exploitation, can you give us some idea of some of the other service sectors that are involved in this and also some of the industrial sectors?
Yes, so let's start by industry. Many of you will have heard about bonded labor in mining, for example, in brick kilns. So that's part of industry. It can also be construction. We found through the data collection that we support in many countries, lots of evidence and victims of forced labor in construction sites, whether they are national or migrant workers, both. Can be manufacturing. You know, we all heard about scandals of forced labour in
the garment sector, for example. Yes,
for example. In services, we have mainly the wholesale and trade. Could be retail shop, but also hotel sector, accommodation, restaurant, food service. It could be administrative support services. We found some cases in many countries. and a lot in transportation. And just to complete, under agriculture, we also count fishing, which is a sector in which we found lots of forced labor.
Yes, on the fishing boats who are far out at sea. And the ILO, I know, has done quite a lot of work in this area.
And fish processing.
And fish processing. What about the geographical spread? Are there any particular areas that are better or worse in this, or any particular factors that govern how it pans out globally?
So you may remember from our report in 21 that forced labor was found everywhere. There is not a single country where there is no case of forced labor.
So it's not a rich or poor thing then?
No, it's not. It's not. And I even had this U-shaped curve, linking forced labor prevalence with GDP and showing that, there is... it's not linear. There is also forced labor in the very rich countries because of migration and migrant workers being more at risk of being in forced labor.
But are there different types of forced labor in different types of countries?
There is, although the sectors I mentioned before were found in all parts of the world. Now, if we go back to profit, we have to relate the number of the victims per region and the profit by victims. And for that, we were able to measure this time in 2024 with figures of the last years, the profit per victim was highest in Europe and Central Asia, and there is no surprise because of the GDP and the value of the work of the victims, and in Arab states as well. And then a bit less, so it's around 20,000 per victim in those regions.
Because in those countries, those people should be being paid more for their labour.
Yes, and are paid really less. So the difference was estimated around 20,000 per victim and per year, compared to 5,000 per victim and per year in Africa and Asia.
Right, okay. So every country in the world. What do you think are some of the consequences of the growth of this? I suppose you might even call it an industry in itself.
It's a crime.
It's a crime.
It's a crime. We call it a crime.
Yeah.
It is a crime. It's defined forced labor is a crime, and so is trafficking for forced labor or trafficking,
which is also intimately linked.
Yes, or trafficking for sexual exploitation. It's a crime and should be combated as a crime, and we'll come back to that. The consequences are first for the victim themselves. They suffer exploitation, they suffer in their bodies. We are now start looking at the health consequences of the victims of forced labor. They lose money. They cannot communicate. They suffer psychological violence. So there is a lot of research on the consequences for the victims. But there are also consequences for the state. I don't know, Anousheh, if you want to take over.
Hello, everyone. Hello to you, Sophie, and thank you very much for this invitation. Yes, it is very important for us to emphasize on the fact that the work done by the ILO is very important for objectivizing, the phenomenon, and also better understanding the linkages between forced labor and economic incentives. It is a business case, first of all. And what is important is that what has been put forward is about the fact that 9 out of 10 victims of forced labor are in the private sector. So this is a matter of co-responsibility between businesses, corporates, and the public sector and governments. What can we say we did and we should do as governments? First of all, we should say again that it is a crime. Forced labor is a crime. Human trafficking is a crime. These are illegal practices. So they should be punished. They should be punished by prosecution, by penal prosecution. And this is the area in which France has made progress. In 2022, for example, we had more than 1,000 sentences pronounced against perpetrators. And out of them, 673 firm prison sentences, and with an average of 26 months of imprisonment, because this is a crime, this is illegal, and we should now think about remedies for the victims when we can identify them. So identification, flushing out, putting this out is very important. So detection, identification, and then prosecution is the very chain of responsibility we can take over amongst governments. The second thing governments could do is about tackling the root causes of forced labor. Root causes of forced labor relate to our fight against poverty. It is also about our fight against informality in the economy and lack of social protection. For all these issues, we should know that those who have recourse to forced labor are those that need it to survive. So this is very important to put also the question of living wage in the middle of, this landscape. This is the part governments can do, but also companies have their own responsibility on that. They should, as Michaëlle said about, migration, they should put forward fair recruitment processes. They should exert their due diligence on their value chains, on the global supply chains from, our MNEs, our multinational enterprises in the north through the south, where we have all these subcontractors that could, of course, exert forced labor.
But this is pretty tough, of course, because a lot of these supply chains involve many countries. They're very multinational. So by definition, this requires a multinational solution. Now, you used to lead Alliance 8.7. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about that and what you think from that perspective can be done at a multinational level, involving a lot of countries at different levels of development with different legal systems.
Yeah, of course. And this is very important to say that partnership, international partnership, is key in this situation. What I said about penal prosecution is very important, that it should be international. If not, forced labor goes from one country to the other. And that is the main issue. The other thing is about, global partnership. And this is what we did with Alliance 8.7, which is a global partnership against forced labor, child labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery. And we put around the same table all stakeholders, governments, companies, social partners, because one key issue also for detecting forced labor is to have trade unions in companies, and even in small companies in global south.
Because they see things.
They see things, they can just, fight against it locally. And also around the table, we have international organizations as the ILO, but also FAO, and all the others, because this issue is not only a matter of one specific sector. So multi-stakeholder proceedings plus whole of government, work at the global level. And what we did with Alliance 8.7 is that in those countries that we have a big prevalence of forced labor, to have national plans to fight against forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking together.
I would like to just come back on that. And extremely important to know that to combat forced labor, sometimes the main thing to do is to combat discrimination, because in this country, those people in forced labor are those who are victims of discrimination because of any ground of discrimination, their ethnic group, their religion, whatever. And that put them at risk of forced labor. But also, all the policies related to decent work is the best way to combat forced labor. And this includes the freedom of association, collective bargaining, where workers can stand up for the right, the risk of forced labor decrease. And in order to do that in an efficient way at national level and international level, we need good data.
Anousheh, you have one quite final point you'd like to make.
Yeah, because, I mean, it is very important to emphasize the fact that decent wages is really key in this issue. And when for example, in fishing, we have payment per share of fish caught, or in agriculture, pay per piece work, this is a way to encourage forced labor. So living wage and the work that has been done by the experts of the ILO on a tripartite level about how to frame living wage at each country is really very important measure in order to fight against forced labor.
Well, this is a subject that I'm sure we will be returning to, sadly, because it's not going away anytime soon, but also because it's extremely important to talk about it and to discuss solutions. But that is all we have time for today now. Thank you so much to my guests, Michaëlle de Kock, who is head of the research unit of the Fundamental Principle Department here at the ILO, and Anousheh Karvar, who is the French government delegate to the ILO. And the new report is called Profits and Poverty, the Economics of Forced Labour. You can find it on the ILO's website. Once again, thank you for listening. Please join us again soon for another Future of Work podcast.